Donald Trump made 41 distinct promises for his first day in office. You know, something light to kick off his term, from cutting funding to schools that teach what he thinks is critical race theory, to starting the largest deportation operation in American history, to perhaps his most ambitious promise of all, to end Russia's war on Ukraine in 24 hours. Highly unlikely, not only because it's a ludicrous claim, but also because that horrific 33-month war is escalating as we speak. Last week, the outgoing Biden administration gave Ukraine permission to use American long-range missiles for attacks inside of Russia for the first time since the Russians invaded in February 2022. Vladimir Putin responded by firing a brand new hypersonic intermediate-range ballistic missile into Ukraine. He's also believed to have brought in around 10,000 North Korean soldiers who are reportedly stationed on the Russia-Ukraine border, ready to fight on Putin's behalf any day now. So what chance an end to this war anytime soon? Earlier this month, for the first time, a narrow majority of Ukrainians said they wanted to see a quick, negotiated end to the conflict. So let's debate this. Is it time to end this war? And if so, on whose terms? Or should the West be helping the Zelensky government in Ukraine with more military support against an illegal Russian invasion? I'm joined by the Quincy Institute's Eurasia Program Director, Anatol Lieven, who has written multiple books on Russia, Ukraine, and the Baltics, and the McCain Institute's Executive Director, Evelyn Farkas, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense under President Obama. Thank you both for joining me on the show. Evelyn, let me start with you. You've said that you don't believe Joe Biden's latest move with the missiles is escalatory, and you even said it should have come a lot sooner. But by definition, hasn't it been escalatory, because we've now had Putin fire his own brand new ICBM into Ukraine in response?
Well, I think, first of all, Mehdi, thank you for having me on. Second, I would say that Putin's the one that's been escalating all along. Even that last example that you gave, it's Putin escalating. The reality is we've been providing, as you know, weapons to Ukraine since 2014. And yes, we've put some rules on the use of those weapons, but the reality, it doesn't change the reality that we've been supporting Ukraine indirectly in this war with Russia. So the Biden administration justified the decision to allow the Ukrainians to use long-range artillery against, frankly, fixed ammunition depots and the like inside of Russia because of the introduction by Vladimir Putin, the escalatory move, introducing another country into the war, and that is to say North Korea, because North Korean troops now are in Russia getting ready or are already attacking Ukrainians.
Anatol, Putin is the one escalating, not Biden. Is that an analysis you share?
Well, I mean, they're both escalating. That's what a cycle of escalation is. One side does one thing and the other does something in response. I mean, obviously, the biggest escalation was Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
Yes.
Now, the Russians did that in response to, what they saw as us pushing forward against their vital interests. But no, there's no question that was the biggest step. But Putin did warn that firing missiles into Russia, guided, remember, by US intelligence, would lead to Russian escalation, and so it has. Although limited Russian escalation, there are many more things they could do.
He's lowered formally the threshold for Russia's use of nuclear weapons. He's now saying he can use nukes in response to a conventional non-nuclear attack on Russia by a country that's supported by a nuclear power, which is basically Ukraine. Evelyn, does that give you pause for thought? Does that keep you up at night as a former Pentagon official?
Well, it always keeps me up at night to hear Vladimir Putin throw around nuclear threats. It keeps President Xi of China awake at night. And in fact, we know that earlier this year in April, he actually publicly told Putin that because he said no country should use nuclear threats. So he clearly signaled to the Russians, if publicly, if not privately, that is a dangerous road to go down. And the reality is there are a lot of reasons why Vladimir Putin is bluffing, that he wouldn't use a nuclear weapon out of anger for the first time since World War II. It won't change anything for him militarily. It will cause incredible political risk and literal fallout for his troops and for his people. So the idea that he would actually use a nuclear weapon is appalling, but also doesn't seem very practical. And we know with Vladimir Putin, each time he's made such a bluff that he would either use nuclear weapons or escalate in some fashion that would be unacceptable to Ukraine or to Ukraine's partners, he's actually backed off. So we know that he's a bully.
Can I jump in and say, Bob Woodward has a new book out, which I'm sure you've seen, in which he says that back in 2022, Joe Biden's own top intelligence officials were saying privately they believe there was a 50% chance that he would use nukes. 50% is a pretty high probability for the use of a nuclear weapon.
Well, I can't comment on what they used to base that intelligence analysis on. Perhaps they saw him moving some weaponry. But again, I believe that it's less than 50%, just based on my study of Vladimir Putin and the intelligence that I've read while I was an official. And also the reality that it won't change anything to help him on the battlefield, maybe temporarily, but again, the consequences for him would be grave.
Anatol, do you agree with that, the analysis on the nuke risk?
Well, I mean, the CIA had that analysis in the autumn of 22 because at that time it looked as if Russia was actually losing very badly and might lose key positions. You remember that was when the Ukrainians drove Russia out of Kharkov province, forced the Russians to withdraw from Kherson. And I think it's always been very clear that, I mean, Putin is not going to use nuclear weapons in order to win. He's going to use them if it ever looks as if he's going to lose. Now, the only way now that he's going to lose is if NATO intervenes directly, sends aircraft or an army to Ukraine. Very unlikely. But
especially under a Trump presidency, which is around the corner.
Indeed. Though, the French and the Poles have sometimes suggested that. But that's what this bluster is intended to deter. And that's why the CIA had the analysis that it did in the autumn of 22. But
how
not
much does the
then.
ATACMS, these missiles that the Americans have given the Ukrainians or allowed them to use to strike inside of Russia, how much does that increase the nuclear risk in your view at all?
Well, I mean, obviously, if you have US intelligence guiding American-made missiles to their targets inside Russia, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the Cold War. This would have been seen as a nightmarish threat. But they don't critically change the military balance on the ground. I mean, what worries the Russians is that if they let this red line be passed, NATO might go further and further until a point where there really might be a direct war.
Evelyn, Anatol says the NATO intervention angle is what would really raise the stakes here, which he says is unlikely. Interestingly, you wrote in an op-ed that Joe Biden should actually push to expedite Ukraine's invitation into NATO. And you write, without the prospect of a NATO security umbrella, Ukraine will be another kind of duck, a sitting duck in Vladimir Putin's sights. I wonder, Evelyn, number one, Trump's never going to agree to that. Number two, a lot of European countries aren't going to sign on to that. But number three, wouldn't that vindicate Russia's original, quote unquote, justification for invading Ukraine, which is NATO's out to get us?
Okay, so there are a couple questions there. First of all, with regard to the NATO allies, as recently as a couple months ago, they were all aligned actually in favor, and it was our government that still wasn't prepared to allow Ukraine into NATO. Of course, under any scenario, they probably were going to wait until after the elections. Now, you're right, with President Trump coming into office, it's not likely that he would agree to a security guarantee in the form of a NATO membership guarantee. However, I can't rule it out entirely, because if President Trump really wants a peace deal, the only peace deal that's going to hold while Vladimir Putin is in the Kremlin, in the eyes of the Ukrainians and in the eyes of most of the Russia-Ukraine analysts and experts that I know, is one that includes a security guarantee for Ukraine that Vladimir Putin, again, assuming he's still in office, that he won't view any peace deal as a ceasefire and attack later. So something needs to be given to Ukraine that is a real guarantee that requires Senate ratification, which ironically, President Biden can't get that probably, but President Trump could. So I don't rule it out entirely, Mehdi. If he ends up realizing, he being President Trump, that the only way to peace is to convince Vladimir Putin that Ukraine Ukraine must have this security guarantee, he might be willing to give it to Ukraine. But Putin would have to be much weakened and willing to make peace.
Anatol, you've previously written that members of the Russian establishment have suggested to you and others the possibility that in return for a treaty of neutrality, excluding NATO membership, Russia would give up its further territorial ambitions and this war as a whole. But doesn't Evelyn make a good point that there's no end to a war that doesn't come with some sort of security guarantee to the Ukrainians who've been through hell for the past couple of years?
Yes, but I mean, NATO is not a viable or convincing security guarantee. All our governments, including Biden's, have said repeatedly, we will not go to war to defend Ukraine. Now, at that point, what is this NATO guarantee? It's empty. But also, there's been this narrative in the West that, if Putin, quote unquote, wins in Ukraine, the next thing he will do is, if not directly attack NATO, test NATO, through some form of aggression against the Baltic states. Look, if Putin wants to test NATO, he will do so in Ukraine. If NATO does take Ukraine in, that's where he will do it. And what I don't understand is that, quite rightly, Article 5 is regarded as critical to the security of Europe. It's an absolute,
This is a mutual security pact.
Yes. But by extending it to a country that we've already said that we won't defend, we are not strengthening the effect of Article 5. We are disastrously weakening it.
Evelyn, fair point there from Anatol. I mean, your former boss, President Obama, was one of the first who said at the time, look, we're never going to fight for Ukraine in the way that Putin's going to fight against Ukraine. It's a bigger interest for him than for us.
Things have changed. As I mentioned, very recently, the Europeans were lined up, and it was our government behind the scenes that was not yet ready to, give the green light to Ukraine becoming a member. The Europeans have become increasingly alarmed at what Russia is doing in terms of sabotage operations on European territory to test NATO's resolve. And Article 5 is deadly serious. The Europeans do not want to go to war with Russia. They much prefer to have Ukraine essentially
forget Europeans for a moment. Americans don't even want to send weapons to Ukraine right now, according to the latest polling. They surely don't want to go to war for Ukraine.
And by the way, the Europeans are not lined up. The Hungarians are against. Opposition parties throughout Europe are against. The Turks are against.
All right, well, let's park the Europeans for a moment and just deal with the Americans here, because we've got Trump coming in. With or without Trump, the American public doesn't want to go to war for Ukraine. That's rightly or wrongly, Evelyn.
Of course not. The problem is that, again, I do believe we have to take Vladimir Putin at his word. Everything he said he would do, he has done. So he has said that he would like to recreate the Soviet Union. The Baltic states, which are members of NATO, were part of the Soviet Union. We know that Putin wants to recreate the neo-imperial Soviet Russian Empire. And we need to deter him. The best way to deter him is to be strong, to stand up to him. Otherwise, we're in a much dangerous scenario.
Isn't there a bit of a contradiction there, Evelyn? You're saying we need to take him at his word when it comes to his expansionist aims. But when he says he might use nuclear weapons, you say we shouldn't take him at his word. He's just bluffing.
You're right. There's a contradiction there. But he's a bully, and he needs to be deterred from taking further military action against NATO. And frankly, the best way to do that is to show him that we mean what we say, that we will back Ukraine up, that his aggressive foreign policy cannot prevail. He's broken the international law and order, frankly, and we need to reestablish the system that we put in place after World War II, which has kept us all out of a world war. But by invading Ukraine in 2014 and seizing Crimea, the first annexation since Hitler did it in Austria, and then now introducing the North Koreans and working with Iran and China, the Russians have set up a really dangerous scenario for us.
Anatol, the North Koreans. Come on, Putin is bringing North Korean troops to use against a European country. He's made genocidal threats in the past. He's denied the existence of Ukraine.
Yeah, come on.
If you say Ukraine doesn't exist as a country, is that not different?
No, Mehdi. Look, he said that the Ukrainians and the Russians are, closely linked peoples.
If you deny the existence of a neighbouring country, is that not a little bit genocide?
Look, what Israel is doing is genocide.
I agree. You don't have to get me on that. And Israelis also say Palestinians don't exist.
Exactly. But they're doing something about it.
Well, let's park the debate about how genocidal Putin is. North Korean troops.
Yeah, well, that is certainly...
I mean, that's what is the West supposed to do? Turn a blind eye to that? I wonder, are there some on the anti-war side, the pro-negotiation, who are a little bit naive about Putin's intent?
Well, look, first, we have to actually remember, none of these North Koreans have actually been produced for us yet. Now, if they are, I'll believe it, but we haven't seen them in action yet.
I mean, there's also talk now of Yemeni mercenaries being brought in as well.
Yeah.
Lots of reporting.
Perhaps. But it's, of course, this is an escalation, no question. But if it's true, what it also demonstrates is that the Russians themselves are short of troops. And one key reason for that is that Putin, as Russian hardliners, by the way, repeatedly attack him for, is that Putin has only mobilized a fraction of Russia's reserves. That's because he knows that he has gained the support of the population and the recruits themselves by paying them enormous amounts of money. Now, you can do that with 500,000 troops. You can't do it with 5 million. So actually, this is not still a country fully mobilized for war. Now, that doesn't,
And you believe that gives people an opportunity to do a deal?
Well, I mean, the point is that Putin is not prepared to go the full distance that he would need to go if he was actually aiming to win a complete victory. Now, it may be that the terms set by Russia will be completely unacceptable.
Yeah.
It could be that the terms set by us are completely unacceptable. But we won't know that until we have started negotiations.
So Donald Trump says he wants to start negotiations. Republicans, Evelyn, have said for a while, we need to do a deal, we need to end this war. A lot of kind of MAGA Republicans have said, Ukraine should just accept that they're not going to get a bunch of territory back. And what Democrats have said for a long time, and other liberals who support Ukraine, have said you cannot throw the Ukrainian people under the bus. The Ukrainians want to fight. The Ukrainians don't want to give up their land. We should support them, which is a valid position. But what do you do when you have a Gallup poll, as you do this month, which for the first time shows that even a majority of Ukrainians say they want a quick, negotiated end to the conflict, and 52% of Ukrainians say they are resigned to the fact that they're going to have to give up territory as part of that. That's where the Ukrainians are now. So are you kind of, are the Democrats almost ahead of where the Ukrainian people are now?
No, I was just in Ukraine almost 2 weeks ago now. Right, I came back right before our elections. And you're right. The Ukrainians are tired. They would like a deal. They don't want a deal, though, that is unjust. But I think they would be willing to swap some of their territory in exchange for a real security guarantee, the knowledge that no other future Russian government, and certainly not a government where Vladimir Putin is still in the Kremlin, would ever attack them and try to erase them, erase their sovereignty, erase their ethnic background, their history. So I think there is the kernel of a deal there, but Vladimir Putin and the elites around him would have to be convinced that time is not on their side. And that's where I think Donald Trump could actually play a constructive role.
I bet you never thought you'd be saying that.
I know.
One last question to both of you, and one last topic relatedly. Evelyn, you believe that one of the ways the US should, quote, punish Russia is by slapping secondary sanctions on countries providing electronics, machine tools, and other precursors that are being used to manufacture drones and other weapons in Russia, you say. Isn't it difficult for the United States today to take a moral position on Russia, to talk about punishing Russia for undeniable war crimes in Ukraine, given the US is also simultaneously funding and arming what Israel is doing in Gaza, war crimes, crimes against humanity, in the eyes of many, a genocide. Many would argue that what Israel is doing in Gaza is worse than what Russia has done in Ukraine. So the US is left in a very strange position where it condemns one, but not the other.
Well, it's not an excuse not to support U.S. policy vis-a-vis Ukraine.
But I'm talking about credibility, not whether you support it or not.
I understand what you're saying, Mehdi. It does hurt our credibility to be supporting Israel without putting some conditions or influence on the way that they are fighting. I mean, they're fighting Hamas, but they, as we know, are killing civilians needlessly, and they're not prioritizing getting back their own hostages. So yes, it does throw some, it does cause credibility issues, but I think if you are addressing each policy separately, you just say to yourself, what is the right thing to do in each scenario? And you can't give a pass to, you can't say, oh, well, because the United States policy in Gaza or vis-a-vis the Palestinian people is I don't believe in it, or it's immoral, therefore I don't support what people are proposing in Ukraine. You need to look at each on its merits and see whether it aligns with U.S. interests and values.
Anatol, has Gaza affected America's ability to get support for its position on Ukraine?
This is technically called hypocrisy, you know, and that is how it is seen in the rest of the world. America cannot ask countries to go against their own interests in the name of appealing to morality while doing what it is doing with Israel. There is simply no moral or legal basis for this. And of course, the thing is, you know, the West is concentrating on Chinese supplies to Russia, which is really what Evelyn has been talking about. But actually, a great many of these imports go into Russia via US partners in the Gulf, via the UAE, via the Caucasus, via India. You start trying to bring secondary sanctions to bear on India, you're going to have a problem. The Indians do not like being bullied in this way, and also we're not going to do it, which once again leads to the whole hypocrisy business. No, I mean, let us explore the possibility of peace, which, by the way, the huge majority of the international community wants. They want a peace deal in Ukraine, and see if it's possible. But I think a point to be made about that is that the Ukrainians are absolutely opposed to giving up any more land as part of a peace deal. But increasingly they are recognizing that as the war goes on, it's impossible to recover the land that they've lost. And the longer that the war goes on, of course, the more land they are actually losing. So the other point to be made is, you know, time is not on Ukraine's side. The deal we get today may be a lot better, or when Trump comes to power, than a deal we will get in a year's time.
Or a year ago. We will never know. Thank you both, Evelyn Farkas, Anatol Lieven. Appreciate you both for your time and for your analysis. Thank you. Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to zeteo.com. Your support matters.